Okay, so today we're gonna dive into something pretty personal and pretty fascinating,
Yeah.
and that is your own exploration into whether or not your experiences and your family history
Right.
align with what we used to call Asperger's syndrome,
hmm
and is now under the broader umbrella of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD.
Yeah, you've given us quite a lot of information to work with here.
You have.
Yeah, your personal recollections about your own experiences, your family background, and even some interesting observations you had from people out in the world.
Right. Yeah,
So,
so our mission here is to really kind of dig into this,
absolutely.
see what we can uncover together.
Yeah.
Now, before we go any further,
Right.
so important to remember, this deep dive is purely for informational purposes.
Of course.
We're not diagnosing anything, and nothing we say here should be taken as such.
Exactly.
Think of us as your fellow explorers,
I like that.
carefully examining the evidence you've given us.
Yeah.
So let's start unpacking this, starting with your family history.
Okay, great.
You mentioned your sister's autism, and that your family understands this to be connected to oxygen deprivation during birth.
Right.
And this actually aligns with a broader understanding in the medical field.
Yeah, research does suggest that certain birth complications, including ones that could potentially lead to a lack of oxygen,
Right.
can increase the likelihood of a child developing ASD.
Okay.
It's like a potential piece of the puzzle, so to speak.
Right. And then we look at your own early childhood, and there were some pretty major events that happened.
Yeah.
You had repeated carbon monoxide poisoning at just 1 year old,
Wow.
and a possible head injury around the age of 2.
Yeah, those are really significant events, especially for a brain that's, developing so rapidly at that age.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of those things?
Well, with the carbon monoxide poisoning, severe cases can definitely lead to neurological damage. And when we think about those early brain injuries, those happening in the first few years of life, like yours,
Hmm.
the scientific literature does explore some potential associations with certain developmental outcomes.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned a PubMed article, and I think it's really important to clarify something about that specific study.
Yep.
That particular article actually looked at the connection between parental autistic traits
Okay.
and the risk of childhood maltreatment,
Well,
highlighting, this complex kind of interplay between genetic and environmental factors.
mm,
But it doesn't directly address a cause and effect link between your early injury and ASD.
okay, so that's a really important distinction to make.
It is.
So that particular study wasn't specifically saying that early brain injuries cause autism,
Right.
but the general idea that early brain injuries can sometimes be associated with
Sure.
developmental differences or an increased risk for ASD-like features
Yeah.
isn't entirely unfounded, right?
That's right. The wider research does look into those kinds of connections. But it's not a simple equation. Early brain injury doesn't automatically equal ASD.
Yeah.
But it can be a factor to consider within a larger, more complex picture.
Right, right. It adds to the picture, to the story.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about your early life
Mhm.
and some potential biological factors.
Right.
Now let's shift our attention to your social experiences
Okay.
and how those play into all of this.
Yeah.
You described feelings of social awkwardness,
Mm-hmm.
a need for some guidance in social situations, and sometimes even missing social cues.
Right.
When we think about ASD, those are often some of the things that come to mind.
They can be, and it's important to acknowledge that, many individuals on the autism spectrum do describe these kinds of challenges, navigating the nuances of social interaction.
Yeah.
Things that might seem obvious or easy to someone who's neurotypical.
Right, like picking up on body language.
Exactly, like understanding nonverbal communication or those unspoken social rules.
Right, those unwritten rules.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you pointed out yourself, there are other potential explanations for these social difficulties.
Of course.
You mentioned being bullied, which
Right.
can have a huge impact on someone's social confidence
Absolutely.
and how they approach interaction.
For sure.
And then there's just personality. Some people are naturally more introverted or less assertive socially.
Right. And that's perfectly fine.
And of course, social anxiety
Yeah,
can create similar feelings of awkwardness and difficulty in social settings.
absolutely. Social anxiety can really make those situations feel so much harder.
Right. And it's interesting because, if we connect this back to your personal history,
Mm-hmm.
the traumatic brain injury and the schizophrenia that developed later,
Right.
those are incredibly significant.
They are.
And both of those conditions independently
Yeah.
can lead to substantial changes in social functioning,
Absolutely.
communication,
Mm-hmm.
perception.
Yeah, it's like imagine the cognitive challenges that can result from a TBI or the negative symptoms that are sometimes associated with schizophrenia.
Right.
These can manifest in ways that might seem to overlap with some of those social characteristics that we sometimes see in ASD.
It's like you're trying to differentiate between different sources of similar-looking symptoms.
Exactly. It's like trying to figure out, is this coming from this or is this coming from that?
Right. Are we looking at the same thing from different angles?
Yeah. It's a really complex situation.
Okay, so there's this real layering of complexity here.
There is.
Where different experiences could be contributing to these similar outcomes.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about some of those external observations you mentioned.
Okay.
Things that have led other people to think about the possibility of ASD for you.
Right. And these are really interesting to consider because they add another layer to our exploration.
Yeah.
So the fact that government recruiters suggested job opportunities through Sourceable, which is a platform that's often used to connect neurodiverse individuals, including those with ASD, with potential employers. That suggests that your skills or the way you communicate might have been perceived as aligning with that profile.
It's like someone saw something in your presentation that resonated with how they understood neurodiversity in the workplace.
Exactly. It's like they saw something and thought, hey, this might be a good fit for someone who's neurodivergent.
Right.
And then being added to an Asperger's WhatsApp group.
Yeah.
That also indicates that at least one person you interacted with recognized traits in you that they associated with Asperger's.
Right.
And then there's your involvement in gifted and talented education, or GATE.
Yeah.
And it's well documented that high intellectual ability and giftedness can sometimes co-occur with ASD.
Right.
So all of these things together paint an interesting picture.
So we've got these external signals, people making these connections, seeing potential overlaps.
Yeah.
But it's really important to emphasize, isn't it?
It is.
That these are just observations, not diagnoses.
Exactly. People can make assumptions based on very limited interactions.
Right.
And, the reasons for adding someone to a group can be very subjective.
Right.
So while these external perspectives are interesting, and they reflect how you might be perceived by some, they don't provide a definitive answer.
Right. They're just pieces of the puzzle.
That's right.
And this brings us to the core of the matter. The complexity of understanding your experiences in the context of ASD.
Yeah.
So we've touched on this idea that ASD is a neurodevelopmental condition.
Right.
What does that actually mean when we're considering your unique situation?
Well, neurodevelopmental essentially means that the fundamental characteristics of ASD are typically present from early childhood. So even if someone isn't formally diagnosed until later in life, the understanding is that the underlying developmental differences were there from the beginning, shaping how that individual interacts with and experiences the world.
And this is where your history gets particularly interesting.
Yeah.
Because you experienced those really significant neurological events, TBI, the schizophrenia, and the epilepsy.
Yeah.
After that early developmental period.
That's right after the age of 18.
Right after 18.
Yeah.
So how do those things all fit together?
Well, it's important to remember that these conditions, the TBI, the schizophrenia, the epilepsy, they can all cause significant changes in brain function. Impacting cognition, social behavior, perception. So there's this real potential for symptom overlap. Some of the social or communication challenges you're experiencing now could be a direct result of the TBI or the schizophrenia, rather than lifelong traits associated with the ASD.
Right. So it's like we're trying to untangle different threads that have kind of become interwoven.
Exactly. It's like these different threads that have gotten all mixed up over time.
Right. You mentioned that you were functioning well socially before the age of 18.
Right.
And that seems like a really important detail.
It is, because in general, the understanding is that while ASD can be recognized later in life, the core features are usually thought to have been present during childhood. So your recollection of functioning well socially before 18, that's a crucial piece of information, and it really needs to be carefully evaluated by professionals who can look at it within the full context of your history.
Okay, so taking all of this into consideration, your early history, your later experiences, this potential for these overlapping symptoms, it really highlights the limitations of trying to figure this out on your own.
It does.
Or even for us to provide any definitive conclusions in this deep dive.
Exactly. I mean, as an AI, I can analyze and synthesize information.
Right.
But I can't perform the kind of comprehensive clinical assessment that would be required.
Right.
That would involve, detailed interviews, behavioral observations conducted over time,
Yeah.
and potentially even neuropsychological testing.
Okay.
And all of this should be carried out by qualified healthcare professionals.
So what would you recommend for our listener?
Well, the most important thing is to seek a comprehensive evaluation.
Yeah.
Have an open and honest conversation with your psychiatrist
Okay.
and your neurologist about these concerns. Provide them with your full history.
Yeah.
Talk about your experiences in childhood, the events that led to the TBI, the onset of schizophrenia and epilepsy,
Right.
and how you're functioning in your daily life right now.
Okay. And if they feel it would be beneficial, they might recommend a referral to a neuropsychologist?
Absolutely, because neuropsychologists, they specialize in understanding the relationship between brain function and behavior.
Right.
They're really good at conducting those assessments that can help differentiate between various neurodevelopmental conditions and the effects of acquired brain injuries or psychiatric conditions.
So this process of really distinguishing between potential lifelong traits and symptoms that might have come from these other conditions, that's what you're calling differential diagnosis.
That's right. It's like detective work.
Yeah.
To really try to understand what's going on, carefully ruling out possibilities to get to that most accurate picture.
So while we can't offer you a diagnosis here, we can say it's completely valid and insightful for you to be exploring these questions.
Absolutely. Asking these kinds of questions and trying to gain a deeper understanding of yourself, that's a really valuable sign of self-awareness.
Right.
But to get some real clarity and an accurate understanding of your situation, seeking that professional evaluation, that's really the best next step you can take.
So as you continue on this journey of self-discovery, consider this. Given the kind of intricate interplay between, those developmental factors of early life and the significant impacts of these later experiences, like the traumatic brain injury and schizophrenia, how might a deeper understanding of neurodiversity in all its forms reshape your own personal narrative of identity and experience?
It's a powerful thing to think about.
It is food for thought.
It is.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.